Welcome to Family Revenge Secrets, the podcast that peels back the polished facade of family photos and dives into the messy, complicated truths that lie beneath. If you've ever felt like the weight of your family's past is a story you need to understand, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It's time to learn how to navigate the silent wars, the hidden resentments, and the fierce, unyielding love that holds it all together. This season, we're starting with a story that echoes in millions of homes, a tale of sacrifice and blame called, "My Son Blames Me for His Failures." The scent of roasting chicken filled the air, a familiar aroma that for Alina felt less like comfort and more like a silent accusation. It was Tuesday, their designated family dinner night, a ritual she'd upheld for 25 years with the unwavering faith of a high priestess. The table was set with a floral tablecloth, the good china, and 3 glasses, one for her husband, David, and a third for their son, Ethan. The third glass, however, was a monument to hope, a vessel rarely filled, or if so, only with a bitter, unspoken liquid. Alina was 50, but the lines around her eyes and the faint gray in her one-auburn hair weren't just from age. They were from effort. A lifetime of quiet, persistent effort. She had traded a promising career in advertising for a life of school pickups, bake sales, and late-night talks about teenage angst. She had poured her ambition into a single, beautiful container, her son. She had polished him, protected him, and in her mind, given him every tool to succeed. Ethan, at 25, was a monument of a different sort, a monument to potential unfulfilled. He had the sharp mind of his father but the restless spirit of an artist, a combination that felt more like a curse than a gift. His face, once open and hopeful, was now a mask of simmering resentment. He had just been fired from his 3rd job in 2 years, a mid-level marketing position he'd held for less than 6 months. The failure wasn't his, of course. It was everyone else's, and tonight it was squarely his mother's. David, Alina's husband, sat across from her, a quiet man who had always been the emotional buffer between mother and son. He had seen the way Ethan looked at Alina, not with malice, but with a weary, knowing disappointment. David, a successful architect, often felt like he was designing a house he could never live in. He saw the cracks in the foundation, but he didn't know how to fill them. The tension in the air was as palpable as the steam rising from the chicken. Alina served the plates, her hands moving with practiced grace. "It smells wonderful, Mom," David said, trying to break the silence. Ethan snorted, a sharp, dismissive sound. "It's just chicken, Dad." Alina's smile faltered. "I added a little rosemary this time, Ethan. I know you like it." He pushed his plate away, the silverware clattering. "What I like, Mom, is a choice. A life that isn't a direct copy of the one you drew up for me." The words, though not new, felt like fresh wounds. Alina's breath hitched. "I don't understand, Ethan. We've always supported you." "Supported me? You put me in a box. You wanted a doctor, so you pushed me into pre-med. You wanted me to have a stable job, so you paid for my business degree. You know what you didn't do. You didn't ask me what I wanted." His voice rose with each word, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "I wanted to go to art school, Mom. I wanted to paint, but you said that was a hobby, not a career." David cleared his throat. "Son, that's not fair. Your mother wanted what was best for you. She gave up her career to be here for you." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "Oh, that old line, the great sacrifice. You think I don't see it? It's a weight, Mom. It's a burden you hang around my neck, and then you wonder why I can't fly. Every time I fail, it's not my fault. It's because the path I'm on was never my own. It was a path you built for me with your good intentions and your endless guilt." Alina felt the sting of his words, a burning sensation in her chest. She had always believed in the purity of her intentions. She had done everything by the book, from reading parenting magazines to consulting therapists. She had been the perfect mother, or so she thought. And now, the child she had poured her life into was telling her that her love was not a gift, but a cage. She looked at her son, at the resentment carved into the lines of his face, and for the first time, she saw herself not as a hero in a story of sacrifice, but as a villain in his. The silent accusation that had hung in the air for years was now a spoken truth. The roast chicken, the good china, the floral tablecloth, all of it felt like a hollow facade. The family dinner, a symbol of their unity, had become a battlefield, and in the silent, aching space between them, Alina realized that the wounds were just beginning to show. Alina stood at the kitchen sink, the water running hot over her hands as she scrubbed a stubborn piece of gristle from a plate. The air still hummed with the ghosts of Ethan's angry words, and the scent of rosemary, once so inviting, now felt like the perfume of a battlefield. David had retreated to the living room, a silent, disappointed silhouette in the gloom. The unspoken question hung between them, as heavy as the silence. How did we get here? She dried her hands on a dish towel and walked to the living room, but the urge to be alone was too strong. She went to the den, a small room she had long ago designated as her sanctuary. It was filled with photo albums and boxes of old keepsakes, a museum of her life's work. She pulled a dusty album from a shelf, the one with the faded cloth cover, and sat down on the old armchair. The first page was a blurry ultrasound photo. A smudge. A promise. She remembered the day she saw it, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was 25, a rising star at a high-end advertising agency in New York. The office pulsed with creative energy, late-night brainstorming sessions, and the exhilarating thrill of a successful campaign. She had her own apartment in a trendy neighborhood and a closet full of clothes she actually wore. Life was a steep climb, and she loved the view from the top. Then came Ethan. She had pictured it all so clearly. A life where she could have both, the big campaigns and the beautiful baby. But the city, with its demanding hours and relentless pace, soon proved to be a harsh master. The pediatrician's words echoed in her memory. Babies need structure, Mrs. Hughes, they need stability. The choice, which had seemed so impossible at first, slowly began to feel like the only one. David's salary was more than enough. "We can manage," he had said, his face full of quiet reassurance. So she quit, not with a sigh, but with a breath of pure, unadulterated love. She had a new campaign to run now, and its name was motherhood. The photo album pages turned, a chronological record of her sacrifice. There was Ethan, a chubby toddler with a wide grin, clutching a baseball bat too big for him. She remembered spending hours in the backyard, her hand over his small ones, guiding him to swing. His first home run was a triumphant cry that still rang in her ears. Another picture. Ethan, 7 years old, in a school play, dressed as a tree. She had stayed up for 3 nights straight, stitching together his costume from scratch. He'd beamed at her from the stage, a look of unadulterated admiration in his eyes. He had a talent for drawing. Even as a little boy, his sketches were more than scribbles, they were stories. She kept a shoebox of them in her closet, a picture of a knight on a horse, a dragon with sad eyes. She'd encouraged it, bought him the best paints and easels. But as he got older, the world outside her home grew more insistent. The whispers of friends, the subtle pressures from school. Is he going to be an artist? That's a tough life. The voice of a guidance counselor. Ethan is bright. He could go to a top school, an Ivy League. We should focus on subjects that will get him there. Alina listened. She heard the voices of reason, the siren song of security. She had wanted to protect her son from the precariousness of a creative life, from the rejections and the soul-crushing self-doubt. She saw her own past ambition, the years she had worked to get ahead, and she wanted a guaranteed path for him. So she shifted the focus. The art supplies were still there, but they became a weekend activity, not a passion. She began to push the things that would ensure his success. The SAT prep classes, the summer internships at engineering firms. The conversation about his future became less about his dreams and more about her blueprints. She remembered the day she convinced him to choose a business degree over a fine arts program. He was 17, and the look on his face was one of weary resignation. "It's just for a fallback, honey," she had said, her hands on his shoulders, her voice a soothing balm of good intentions. "You can always paint on the side." He had nodded, but his eyes, for the first time, were distant. The light had gone out of them. A light she hadn't even noticed had been snuffed out. Sitting there in the den, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, Eleanor saw the pattern she had woven. Every choice, every nudge, every well-intentioned word was a thread. But what she saw as a beautiful, strong tapestry, her son saw as a web. She had believed she was giving him wings, but he felt she was building him a cage. The sacrifice she had so willingly made for him, the life she had given up, was not his treasure. It was his curse. Eleanor closed the photo album. The happy memories, the moments of pure, selfless love, now felt tainted. They weren't a shield against his anger. They were the very cause of it. She had poured her entire being into her son, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten to let him be his own. The first glance at her son, that night at the dinner table, had not just been a look of anger. It had been the first time she truly saw him as a stranger who believed his entire life had been written by her, and who was now demanding a different ending. The silent war had found a voice, and it was telling her that her love, the very thing she had always believed would save them both, was what had torn them apart. The morning after the dinner, the house felt colder than usual. The silence was not a peaceful one, but a fragile ceasefire. Eleanor moved through the kitchen, the familiar scent of coffee a small comfort in the crushing aftermath. David had already left for work, a note on the counter saying only, "Sorry, early meeting." It was his way of avoiding a conversation they both knew they needed to have. A silent retreat, leaving her to face the wreckage alone. The wreckage arrived a few hours later in the form of a phone call. It was Ethan. His voice, usually sharp and accusatory, was flat and hollow. "I got fired, Mom." Eleanor's heart sank. She pictured his face, the defeated slouch of his shoulders. "Oh, honey, what happened? What happened?" He repeated, his voice rising, the bitterness returning. "What happened is I'm not a numbers guy. I'm not a team player. They said I lack engagement and initiative. It's the same old story. I'm in a cubicle, staring at spreadsheets, trying to be someone I'm not." The words tumbled out, each one a stone thrown at her. "I knew it was coming. I just didn't want to admit it, but here we are, unemployed, again." Eleanor felt a familiar knot of panic in her stomach. "Ethan, it's not the end of the world. You'll find something else. Maybe a different company." "A different company doing the same soul-crushing job you pushed me into." He interrupted. "Don't you see, Mom? This is all because of you, because you told me that art was a hobby, because you said a creative life was irresponsible. You filled my head with all this nonsense about stability and a pension plan, and now I'm $30,000 in student loan debt with a degree I hate and a resume full of failure." The accusations were no longer a distant thunder. They were a storm crashing directly over her head. He was relentless, a surgeon of blame, cutting away at her every defense. "You built this. You built this life for me, and now you can stand there and watch it fall apart. Every single failure is on you." The phone line went silent. Eleanor waited, her hand trembling, but he had already hung up. The dial tone buzzed in her ear, a tiny, infuriating sound. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a life she thought she had perfected. The perfectly arranged fruit bowl, the clean counters, the calendar with her appointments meticulously written in neat handwriting. It all felt like a lie, Just then the front door opened and David walked in. He was early. "I couldn't stay," he said, his face etched with worry. The silence at home was better than the noise at the office. He saw the phone in her hand. Was that Ethan? Alina simply nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "He was fired. He says it's my fault." David put his arms around her, a comforting gesture that did little to calm her shaking. "He's just lashing out. He's hurting." "He's hurting," she whispered. "Because of me, he truly believes it." The weight of his conviction felt heavier than any logical argument. It wasn't just a passing fit of rage. It was a deeply held belief, a truth in his own mind. The thought of it was unbearable. That evening, as they sat in strained silence, David tried to rationalize it. "Alina, you did what any parent would do. You wanted him to have a good life, a secure life. The world is a tough place for an artist. But I was wrong, David. I see that now," she said, her voice thin. "I was so focused on building the life I thought was best for him that I never stopped to ask what he actually wanted. I was selfish. I poured all my own unfulfilled ambition into him. I wanted to be a successful creative, and when I couldn't, I wanted him to be a successful something else, anything else, as long as it had a clear path to success. I took his dreams and replaced them with my fears." Her confession hung in the air, a devastating admission. The woman who had always been so sure of her choices, so confident in her role as the family matriarch, was now admitting to a catastrophic failure. The tension in the house was a living thing. The phone rang and they both jumped, expecting Ethan. It was Rebecca, Alina's sister. Her voice was bright and full of life, a jarring contrast to the gloom. "I'm in town, just for a couple of days. Can I come over tomorrow for lunch?" Alina hesitated. The thought of entertaining, of putting on a brave face for someone so successful and self-assured, was exhausting. "I don't know, Rebecca. It's complicated here." "Oh, nonsense. I'll bring the wine. We can talk about whatever it is that's weighing on you. I'm not a therapist, but I'm a really good listener," Rebecca said with a laugh. Alina agreed, a small flicker of hope igniting in her chest. She needed a perspective that wasn't her own, or David's. She needed someone who could see the situation without the years of emotional history that blinded her. Little did she know, Rebecca's arrival would not be a calming bomb, but a catalyst. A new voice that would not only confirm her fears, but also push her to finally find the strength she had lost in a lifetime of trying to be perfect. The tide of conflict was rising, and Alina was about to find herself at the epicenter of a storm she could no longer hide from. The next day, Rebecca arrived in a burst of energy, her laughter echoing through the quiet house like an unexpected song. She was Alina's older sister by 3 years, but the differences between them felt like a lifetime. Rebecca was a successful art curator in Chicago, unmarried and childless by choice. She wore a tailored blazer and a fierce confidence that had always made Alina feel both proud and slightly inadequate. Rebecca walked into the living room, her eyes taking in the summer scene, David buried in the sports section, Alina staring out the window, a cup of untouched tea on the table beside her. "Looks like someone let all the air out of the room," she said, her tone light but perceptive. "All right, spill, what's going on?" David, ever the diplomat, put down his paper. "Ethan lost his job, again." Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. "The one at the marketing firm? He seemed so miserable there." "Honestly, it's probably for the best." Alina flinched. "He doesn't see it that way. He says it's all my fault, that I never let him be who he was meant to be." Rebecca's face softened. She sat on the couch next to Alina and took her hand. "Alina, let me ask you something. When was the last time you painted, or did anything just for yourself?" The question hung in the air. Alina had to think about it. Years. It had been years since she had picked up a brush. Her life had been a series of responsibilities, each one a brick in the wall she had built around her family. "See," Rebecca said gently, You and Ethan are two sides of the same coin. He's stuck in a life he didn't choose, and you're stuck in a role you defined for yourself 25 years ago. You both gave up on your art for what you thought was a more responsible path. Eleanor felt a fresh sting. The truth of Rebecca's words was undeniable. She had always viewed her sacrifices as noble, a testament to her devotion. Now she was starting to see them as a form of self-erasure and a burden she had unknowingly placed on her son. Later, while David was on a call, Ethan walked in looking defeated. His eyes were red and his posture was a mixture of dejection and defiance. He barely acknowledged his aunt. "Hey, Ethan," Rebecca said, her voice warm but firm. "I heard about the job. I'm sorry. That sounds like a tough blow." Ethan shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "It's fine. It's what happens when you're not built for a 9 to 5. But Mom knows all about that, don't you?" he said, his eyes flicking to Eleanor. The bitterness in his voice was a physical presence in the room. Rebecca didn't flinch. "I see what you're doing, Ethan. You're deflecting. It's easier to blame your mom than to look in the mirror and face the person who's really responsible for your failures." Ethan's face hardened. "You don't know anything about it, Aunt Rebecca. You don't have kids. You don't understand what it's like to have your life dictated by someone else's expectations." "No," Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly. "I don't, because I learned a long time ago that my life is my own, and you know what? So is yours. Your mom made some choices with the best intentions. Maybe they weren't the right ones, but you are a grown man. The choices you make now are on you. You're using her love and her sacrifice as an excuse. It's not a shield, Ethan. It's a crutch, and you're not going to get anywhere until you throw it away." The silence that followed was heavy and final. Ethan's face was a mask of shock and fury. No one had ever spoken to him so directly, so bluntly. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the house, the door slamming behind him. Eleanor stared at her sister, a mix of gratitude and fear in her eyes. "Rebecca, you can't just say that to him." "Oh yes, I can. Someone had to," Rebecca said, her composure returning. "Eleanor, you've spent 25 years walking on eggshells around him. You've taught him that he can get away with anything because you'll always be there to clean up the mess. You have to stop. Your good intentions have become emotional manipulation, and his resentment has become a form of power over you." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Emotional manipulation. Power. She had always seen her relationship with Ethan through the lens of a loving mother and her struggling son. But Rebecca's cold, hard assessment revealed a toxic codependency she had never seen before. Her quiet, persistent effort to protect her son had created a monster of blame, a son who believed his mother's love was a weapon used against him. Rebecca stayed for a few more hours, talking with Eleanor about rediscovering her own identity, about finding a sense of self outside of being a mother and a wife. She planted a seed of an idea, a small rebellion that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. When she left, the house felt different. The air was still heavy with unresolved tension, but there was a new element, a spark of something that felt like resolve. For the first time in a very long time, Eleanor felt a stirring of something she had long forgotten, herself. The view from the outside had not been comforting, but it had been clarifying. The cracks in the foundation of her family were no longer hidden, and for the first time, she had a glimmer of an idea about how to start filling them. The house remained quiet after Rebecca left, but the silence had a different texture. It was no longer the oppressive silence of a tomb, but the stillness before a storm. Eleanor felt it in her bones. The anger she had so long swallowed now felt like a bitter pill she was ready to spit out. Rebecca's words, blunt and unforgiving, had acted like a shock to her system, jolting her out of a 25-year-long emotional slumber. The next morning, Eleanor woke up with a quiet resolve. She made a pot of coffee, but instead of pouring a cup for David, she walked to her small, rarely used office in the back of the house. She opened her laptop, the screen a blinding white, and typed a phrase she hadn't considered in decades: part-time jobs for former ad executives. The search results populated the screen, a list of opportunities that felt both exciting and terrifying. She saw positions for freelance marketing, social media management for local businesses, and even a volunteer coordinator role at a local arts center. The latter caught her eye. It was exactly the kind of work she used to do, and it felt like a small, rebellious nod to the artist she had once been. She spent the next few days applying for several positions, a nervous energy bubbling beneath her calm exterior. David noticed the change. He saw her at the kitchen table, her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop, a look of fierce concentration on her face he hadn't seen since before Ethan was born. "What are you up to?" he asked one evening, his voice full of cautious curiosity. Eleanor looked up, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. "I'm getting a job, David, a real one." He sat down, a look of surprise washing over his face. "Eleanor, are you sure we don't need the money?" "It's not about the money," she said, her voice firm. "It's about me. It's about having something for myself again, something that isn't just about being a wife or a mother." The words were an admission of a need she had long denied. He didn't argue. He just watched her, a look of bewildered respect in his eyes. He had been a partner in her sacrifices, but he had never fully understood the weight of them until now. He saw a woman he hadn't seen in years, a woman with her own ambitions and her own identity. The first ripple of change came in a phone call. The art center wanted to interview her. Eleanor hung up the phone, her heart pounding. She had spent a lifetime preparing for her son's interviews, his first dates, his life. Now, for the first time in a quarter-century, she was preparing for her own. She bought a new dress, a simple but elegant one, and practiced answering questions in front of the mirror. The day of the interview, she felt a nervousness that was almost exhilarating. She was meeting with the director, a woman named Sarah, who had a friendly but direct manner. They talked about her past work, her volunteer experience, and her passion for community. Eleanor spoke with an old fire she thought had long been extinguished. She talked about the joy of connecting people, of bringing ideas to life, of the power of creativity. She felt alive, vibrant, and most importantly, whole. The call came 2 days later. She got the job. The news was a victory, but it was a victory that came with consequences. She told David first, and he gave her a genuine, heartfelt hug, but when she called Ethan, the reaction was different. He didn't offer congratulations. Instead, he bristled. "So you're getting a job now?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What, the world's most devoted mother gig not paying the bills anymore?" Eleanor took a deep breath. She had anticipated this. "Ethan, this isn't about you. This is for me. I need to do this." "For you, what about me?" he said, his voice rising in panic. "What about dinner? What about everything?" "Ethan, you're 25 years old. You can make your own dinner," she said, her voice calm and steady, a new kind of strength in it. "I will still be here, but I won't be just a mother. I will be a leaner, a person with her own life." His silence on the other end of the line was a cold shock. He had always depended on her being available, a constant, unchanging pillar in his chaotic life. Her new job felt like a betrayal, a sign that the safety net he had taken for granted for so long was finally being withdrawn. "Fine," he said, the word dripping with venom. "Go ahead, find yourself. Don't worry about the son you left behind to pick up the pieces." He hung up before she could respond. Eleanor stood there, the phone still in her hand, a new kind of pain in her chest. This was the consequence of her rebellion. Her son, the person she had dedicated her entire life to, was now viewing her decision to reclaim her identity as a form of abandonment. But for the first time, instead of collapsing under the weight of his guilt, she felt a quiet strength. She had made a choice for herself, and she was going to see it through. The first step had been taken, and the path, though uncertain, was finally her own. The first few weeks of Alina's new job were a whirlwind of nervous energy and quiet triumph. She thrived on the new challenge, learning the ropes of her role and connecting with people who saw her not just as a mother, but as a colleague. She came home each evening feeling tired but fulfilled, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. The house, once her entire universe, now felt like just one part of her world. But this new life came at a cost. Ethan's resentment festered. He began to leave the house messier, piles of dirty dishes and laundry accumulating as a silent protest. He would be out for hours, only returning late at night, a surly stranger in his own home. He stopped answering her calls and would only respond to her questions with monosyllabic grunts. The tension, once a low hum, was now a constant, grating static. One evening, he came home after midnight, the key scraping loudly in the lock. Alina was still up, working on a presentation for her new job at the kitchen table. She looked up as he stumbled in, smelling faintly of alcohol. "Where have you been, Ethan?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. He sneered, throwing his jacket onto a chair. "Out. You wouldn't know anything about it. You've been too busy living your new life to care about mine, haven't you?" The words, though familiar, cut deeper tonight. Alina felt the last threads of her patience snap. She stood up, her hands trembling. "That's not fair, Ethan. I've tried to reach out. You're the one who won't talk to me." "Talk to you? About what? About how you're finally fulfilling your dreams? What about mine, the ones you killed?" He shouted, his voice thick with a rage she hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "I went to see my friend Jake tonight. He's starting a new art gallery. He's showing a new artist, some guy who went to art school. You know what he said to me? He said, 'Too bad you didn't stick with it, man. You were the most talented guy I knew.' And you know what I had to tell him? I had to tell him I couldn't, because I had to get a real job. I had to pay for the responsible life you pushed me into." He was a hurricane of blame, his words whipping around her, tearing at the carefully constructed new life she was building. The shame and guilt she had tried to overcome returned, a tidal wave threatening to drown her. But this time, something was different. She wasn't just Alina, the mother. She was Alina, the woman who had fought to reclaim her own life. In a rare moment of pure fury, she lashed out. "Stop it, Ethan." The shout, so uncharacteristic for her, silenced him instantly. He stared at her, his jaw dropping in surprise. "I am done with this," she said, her voice shaking but full of a new, fierce conviction. "I am done listening to you blame me for every single one of your failures. Yes, I made choices. I made them because I was terrified of what would happen if you failed. I wanted to protect you from a world that isn't kind to starving artists. But I did it out of love, and I did it with the best intentions I had at the time." She took a step closer to him, her eyes blazing. "But you are a grown man. I am not the one keeping you from your dreams. You are. You are so busy looking backwards, so focused on blaming me for the past, that you have no energy left to build a future. You refuse to take responsibility. You use my choices as a crutch, a weapon, a convenient excuse, and I will not let you do it anymore." Ethan's face twisted in disbelief, then rage. "You're telling me this, after everything you've done? You're going to pretend you're the victim here?" "No," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "I'm not the victim, and neither are you. We're both just human. I made mistakes. I should have listened to you more, but you have to listen to me now. This is a dead end. Your anger, your resentment, it is a poison, Ethan, and it is killing you. Not me, you." The final words hung in the air, a devastating truth. He stood there, stunned, his face a mixture of shock and profound sadness. He had pushed her so hard for so long, and now, finally, she had pushed back. The wall between them had finally broken, but it had not led to understanding. It had led to an explosive, painful truth that shattered the last pretense of their old relationship. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out of the house, the slam of the door a violent punctuation mark on the night. Eleanor was left standing in the silent kitchen, the glow of her laptop a cold, lonely light. She had finally stood her ground, but in the process, she had driven her son away. And she had no idea what came next. The echo of the slamming door was a physical ache in Eleanor's chest. She didn't move for a long time, just stood in the silent kitchen, the cool air settling around her. Her phone, which she had dropped on the counter in her shock, buzzed with a message from David. "Home soon, you okay?" She couldn't bring herself to answer. She felt a profound emptiness, as if the very foundation of her life had crumbled. The bitter truth she had hurled at Ethan was a weapon she had also used on herself. Meanwhile, Ethan walked the dark streets, the night air doing nothing to cool the fire raging inside him. He had been so sure of his anger, so convinced of his righteousness. He was the hero of his own tragedy, the victim of a mother's well-intentioned tyranny. But her words had hit him with a brutal force. "You are the one keeping you from your dreams. It is killing you." "Not me. You." The words were a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. He wandered aimlessly until he found himself in front of an old, familiar brownstone apartment. He buzzed the intercom, a nameplate reading Jake and Maria glowing faintly in the lamplight. Jake opened the door, a look of tired surprise on his face. "Ethan, what are you doing here at this hour?" Ethan didn't answer. He just walked inside, a broken man. Jake, seeing the raw pain in his friend's eyes, led him to the living room. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the distant hum of the city. "I got fired," Ethan finally mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, I figured," Jake said gently. "You always hated that job." "It's not just the job," Ethan said, the words a dam breaking. "I had a fight with my mom, a real one. She told me I was poison. She said I was a coward for blaming her for everything. And I don't know, maybe she's right." Jake listened, letting his friend talk. Ethan poured out the story of his life, a narrative he had constructed with his mother as the central villain. He spoke of the art school he never attended, the career he hated, the friendships he let wither. But as he spoke the words out loud, they sounded different, less like accusations and more like excuses. "Man, she always loved you so much," Jake said quietly when Ethan was finished. "I remember when we were kids and we were drawing those comic books. Your mom would sit with us for hours, bringing us juice and cookies. She was the one who bought you that giant sketchbook for your birthday, remember? The one with the leather cover." The memory hit Ethan like a physical shock. He had forgotten about that. He had focused so much on the closed doors that he had forgotten about the ones she had opened. He had forgotten about the hours she had spent in his room, admiring his sketches. He had taken her support for granted, and then, when it wasn't enough for his own failures, he had turned it into a weapon. Meanwhile, back at the house, David returned. He found Eleanor huddled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, a desolate figure in the dark room. He sat beside her, pulled her into his arms, and held her as she finally began to cry. "I told him everything, David," she sobbed. "Everything I've ever felt. The fear, the regret. I told him he was poison." What kind of a mother says that to her own child? "A mother who has finally been pushed to her limit," David said, his voice soft but firm. "Eleanor, you have spent a lifetime giving your all to him. Your love, your time, your dreams, you've given until you had nothing left for yourself. And he's just taken it. You had to stop for yourself." He helped her see what Rebecca had seen, that her son's resentment was a form of control, and that for her own emotional survival, she had to set a boundary, no matter how painful. The conversation with David was a slow, deliberate process of healing. He didn't offer quick fixes or empty platitudes. He just validated her pain, her courage, and her profound sense of loss. He helped her understand that in order to rebuild her relationship with her son, she first had to rebuild herself. As Eleanor talked, the weight on her shoulders began to lift. She had been carrying the guilt of her son's failures for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be free. She had spoken her truth, and while it had been a devastating, ugly act, it was also the first step toward a new kind of honesty. Across town, Ethan, still at Jake's apartment, felt a similar shift. He had been a hero in his own story, a victim of circumstance. But in the cold, clear light of his friend's apartment, surrounded by the art he had once dreamed of making, he saw himself for what he was. A man trapped not by his mother's past, but by his own fear of a future he was too afraid to claim. The truth was not a comfortable one. It was painful. It was humbling. But it was also, for the first time in a very long time, his own. The night turned into a blur of raw emotion. After leaving Jake's apartment, the humbling truth of his own cowardice followed Ethan down every street. He saw his life not as a prison built by his mother, but as a cage he had constructed himself, using her good intentions as the bars. He had blamed her for everything: his failed jobs, his lack of passion, the emptiness he felt, because it was easier than admitting his own fear. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to escape the suffocating reality of his life. He found himself at a familiar bar, the kind of place with loud music and cheap whiskey that numbed the sharp edges of his thoughts. He drank not for pleasure, but for oblivion. He tried to text his mom an apology, a half-formed sentence that read, "Mom, I'm sorry." But his fingers, clumsy with alcohol and emotion, only managed to delete the words before he could send them. The alcohol didn't bring oblivion, it brought a reckless, dangerous clarity. He stumbled out of the bar and onto the street, the cold night air hitting him like a shock. A text came from Jake. "Where are you, man? Let's talk." Ethan ignored it. He felt an intense, overwhelming need to do something, anything, to prove he was still alive, that he was still in control of his own destiny. He saw a car approaching, the headlights a blinding glare, and for a split second, a dangerous thought flashed through his mind. A shortcut to all the pain, an end to the suffocating weight of his failure. He stepped off the curb, a sudden, foolish act of self-destruction. The screech of tires was a violent tear in the night's fabric. A horn blared, a furious, urgent sound. The car swerved, missing him by inches, the wind from its passage whipping past his face. He fell backward onto the curb, his head hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. The world tilted, a dizzying kaleidoscope of streetlights and stars. A man got out of the car, shouting at him, his face a mixture of terror and rage. "What the hell is wrong with you, kid?" Ethan didn't answer. He just lay there, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the raw, unfiltered truth of what he had almost done a cold, sobering slap to his soul. The fear he had run from, the fear of failure, was nothing compared to the primal, animal terror of that moment. He had not wanted to die. He had just wanted the pain to stop. He lay there, his body shaken, and for the first time in his life, he was truly, fundamentally afraid of what he had become. Back at home, Elinor was still awake, unable to sleep. She had been crying, but now the tears had stopped, leaving her with a hollow, aching feeling. She heard her phone buzz with a call from an unfamiliar number. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was Jake. His voice was frantic. "Elinor, it's Jake, Ethan's friend. I'm at the hospital. Ethan, he had an accident." Elinor felt the world fall out from under her feet. She and David rushed to the hospital, their minds racing with every horrific scenario imaginable. When they arrived, they found Ethan sitting on a gurney, a bandage on his head, looking pale but coherent. He had a minor concussion and some scrapes and bruises, but nothing more. He had been given a clean bill of health and was being released. The doctor explained that he was lucky, that the car had swerved at the last second. Elinor and David stood in the hallway, relief washing over them in a powerful wave. But when she looked at her son, she didn't see relief on his face. She saw a profound, shattered sadness. He looked at his mother, his eyes raw and vulnerable. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm so sorry about everything. I didn't mean it." He was not talking about the accident. He was talking about a lifetime of angry words, of bitter accusations. The near-death experience had not just been a physical shock. It had been a spiritual awakening. He had looked into the abyss, and what he had seen was not a world without his mother, but a world without himself. The blame and resentment he had clung to for so long had vanished in the face of true, mortal fear. Eleanor walked toward him, her heart breaking for the lost boy in front of her. She wrapped him in a hug, a gesture that was both a comfort and a silent plea for forgiveness. This was not the boy who had shouted at her last night. This was a man, humbled and broken, finally ready to face the truth. The crisis, the one she had feared and fought against for so long, had finally arrived. But in its wake, it had left not wreckage, but a fragile, terrifying opportunity for a new beginning. The hospital room was sterile and silent, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the night. Eleanor sat by Ethan's bedside, her hand resting gently on his arm. David had gone to get coffee, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet aftermath. The bandage on Ethan's head was a small, white symbol of a much deeper wound. He had finally woken up, his eyes clear but filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. "Mom," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "I'm so sorry." The words were simple, but they were the most important ones he had ever said. They were a complete surrender of his armor, a dismantling of the blame he had built his identity around. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I was so angry," he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "I blamed you for everything, for my job, for not being an artist, for not being happy. But when that car came at me, it wasn't your face I saw. It was mine. My failures, my fear, my lies." He looked up at her, the truth of his words written on his face. "I've been a coward, Mom. It was easier to blame you than to admit I was the one who was scared. Scared to fail on my own terms. Scared to be broke. Scared to disappoint myself." He confessed a secret he had guarded for years. The truth was, he had gotten a chance to interview for an art school scholarship in his senior year of high school, a chance he never told her about. He had purposely tanked the interview, afraid that if he were accepted, he wouldn't be good enough to succeed. It wasn't her who had closed the door, it was him. He had convinced himself that she had, because it was easier than facing his own terror. The revelation hit Eleanor with a crushing blow. The foundation of his anger, the very thing she had believed was her fault, had been a lie he told himself. A lie that had consumed both of their lives. She felt a mix of relief and profound sadness for the years they had lost to this deception. "Oh, Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of a mother's heartbreak and a human's understanding. "I should have listened more. I should have pushed you less. I was so focused on building a safe life for you, I didn't realize I was pushing you into a box. I was wrong, too." This was the core of their reconciliation. Not a one-sided apology, but a mutual admission of fault. He had blamed her, and she had allowed herself to be blamed, believing in the righteousness of her sacrifice. But they were both human, both flawed, both carrying their own fears. Later that day, after he was discharged, they returned home. The silence in the car was no longer tense. It was quiet, comfortable, and full of unspoken understanding. When they walked in, David was waiting. He hugged his son, a silent embrace that conveyed all the fear and relief of the night before. That evening, they sat in the living room, not as adversaries, but as a family. Ethan spoke with his father, talking not about his failures, but about his true feelings. He admitted to the fear that had been his constant companion, the pressure he felt to live up to his father's success. David listened, not with judgment, but with empathy. He confessed that he, too, had been afraid of his son choosing an unconventional path, a fear that had led him to stay silent for too long. The conversation that night was a painful but necessary cleansing. They unearthed the buried resentments, the unspoken fears, and the long-held truths. They spoke of the love that had always been there, a powerful undercurrent beneath the stormy surface. They were no longer talking about past mistakes, but about a shared future. Ethan's apology was not a single moment, but a gradual, deliberate process. He began to do little things around the house without being asked. He sat with his mother and asked about her day, about her new job. He looked at her not as a symbol of his past, but as a person with her own life and her own dreams. And Alina, in turn, began to see her son not as a reflection of her sacrifices, but as a man who was finally learning to stand on his own 2 feet. The hospital incident had been a moment of crisis, a brush with tragedy that had jolted them all awake. It had torn down the walls of blame and resentment, revealing the love that had always been at the heart of their family. The journey to healing was far from over, but for the first time in years, they were all walking on the same path together. The days and weeks that followed the hospital incident were filled with a quiet, persistent effort. The dramatic climax had passed, but the real work, the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding, was just beginning. The house, once a silent battlefield, now felt like a construction site, filled with the sounds of tentative conversations and the gentle clinking of life being put back together. Ethan's transformation was subtle but profound. He was still struggling, but the source of his struggle had shifted. It was no longer a fight against his mother's past, but a battle with his own fear of the future. He began to take small, meaningful steps. He got a part-time job at a local coffee shop, a place with a relaxed atmosphere where he could interact with people without the crushing pressure of corporate life. The paycheck was small, but the sense of purpose was immense. He started putting away a little bit of money, a small fund for a dream he was now daring to whisper to himself. He also started to draw again, not with the angry, frantic energy of his past resentments, but with a quiet, meditative focus. He bought new sketchbooks, and his pages began to fill with new, hopeful images. He showed them to Alina one afternoon, his voice shy but proud. She looked at his work, vibrant, raw, and full of emotion, and her heart ached with a mix of joy and regret. She saw the talent she had always known he had, and she saw the years of potential she had feared he would never unlock. Alina, in turn, was flourishing in her new role. The art center was a vibrant, welcoming environment, and she found immense satisfaction in using her old skills to help a cause she believed in. Her work was a daily reminder that her identity was not a static thing, defined by her past choices, but a living, breathing entity that could evolve and grow. She learned how to set boundaries with Ethan, a small but powerful act of self-care. She was supportive without being suffocating, and for the first time in his life, Ethan learned to stand on his own feet without her help. One evening, Ethan came home from work and found Alina on the front porch, a box on her lap. He sat beside her, curious. She opened it, revealing an old set of her own art supplies from her college days, now yellowed with time. "I found these in the attic," she said, a wistful smile on her face. "I thought maybe you could use them, or maybe we could use them together." It was a small gesture, but it was a powerful one. It was a bridge between their past and their present, an acknowledgement of the artist she had been and the artist he was becoming. They didn't talk much about it. They just sat there in the fading light, 2 people who had almost lost each other, now finding a way back, one small, tentative step at a time. Their conversations became more authentic. They talked about their days, their anxieties, their small victories. Ethan spoke with honesty about his fear of his new freedom, and Alina spoke about the fear that had kept her from it for so long. They were no longer a mother and a son trapped in a cycle of blame, but 2 adults learning to see each other as human beings. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a phone call. It was Jake. He had heard from Rebecca about Ethan's new work and had seen some of his sketches on social media. He offered Ethan a small, unpaid internship at his new gallery, an opportunity to learn the business of art from the ground up. It was a lifeline, a chance to get his foot in the door without the pressure of a traditional job. Ethan's excitement was palpable. He hugged his mother, a long, genuine embrace that spoke volumes. "I'm doing it, Mom," he said, his voice full of hope. "I'm going to try." The final scene of the chapter shows Elena watching him as he takes a call from Jake, a serious but focused look on his face. He was no longer the angry boy trapped in the past. He was a man, finally building his own future. The bridges had been rebuilt. The foundation was stronger. And for the first time in a very long time, Elena looked at her son and saw not the child she had to protect, but the man he was becoming, a man she could finally, truly, be proud of. The final chapter of their story was not a sudden, dramatic conclusion, but a gentle unfolding. Months had passed since Ethan started his internship at Jake's gallery. He had found a rhythm that suited him, a life filled with long days of hard work and late nights of inspired creativity. He was no longer just drawing, he was painting on large canvases, his strokes filled with a newfound purpose. His art, once a reflection of his pain, was now a celebration of his liberation. He lived in a small apartment now, a place that was his alone. The space was filled with canvases, tubes of paint, and the faint, earthy smell of turpentine. It wasn't a perfect life. The money was tight and the hours were long, but for the first time the struggles were his own and he faced them with a quiet resilience. He had stopped looking at failure as an identity and started seeing it as a temporary state. Elena, too, had found her own sense of peace. Her work at the Art Center had blossomed. She had organized a successful charity event using the skills she had honed in her past life. She had a new group of friends, a life outside of being a mother and a wife. She and David had grown closer, their relationship no longer defined by the silent tensions of raising a child, but by the quiet intimacy of two people who had navigated a storm together. The final scene of their story took place on a warm summer evening. It was Ethan's first gallery showing, not a solo exhibition, but a small part of a larger, community-focused event. The gallery was filled with people, the air buzzing with excitement. Elena and David stood in a corner, watching their son, a proud and nervous figure in a dark jacket. Elena looked at David, a simple, knowing smile on her face. "Who would have thought," she whispered, "that this is where we would end up?" "We both did," David said, taking her hand. "We just had to let him find his own way here." They watched as people gathered around Ethan's paintings. The art was raw, emotional, and honest. One piece in particular was a haunting portrait of a woman with a weary but loving expression, her hands cradling a small, fragile seedling. The title was a single word: sacrifice. Eleanor's breath hitched. She saw herself in that painting, not as a villain, but as a person who had made a choice out of love. And in that moment, she felt a profound sense of absolution. Ethan walked over to them, a look of quiet triumph on his face. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice genuine. "We wouldn't have missed it for the world," Elena said, her eyes welling with tears. She hugged him, not just as a mother hugging her son, but as one artist to another, one human being to another. The embrace was a powerful symbol of their journey. They had torn down the old walls of resentment and built a new bridge of mutual respect and understanding. Later, as they were leaving, Ethan walked them to their car. The streetlights cast long shadows and the night felt peaceful. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, I've been thinking, maybe we could start a new tradition, family dinners, but this time I cook my way." Eleanor's smile was the most beautiful thing David had seen in years. "I would love that, honey," she said. The story was not over. It had simply reached a new, more hopeful chapter. The old wounds were still there, but they had healed into scars, reminders of a past they had survived. They were no longer victims of their history, but architects of their future. Ethan had found his peace, not by severing ties with his past, but by understanding and accepting it. And Alina had found her freedom, not by abandoning her role as a mother, but by expanding her identity to include herself. Their story, like all family stories, was messy and complicated, but it was also a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness, the courage of self-discovery, and the fierce, unyielding love that, in the end, held it all together. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We hope that Ethan and Alina's story has offered you a glimpse into the complex but ultimately beautiful nature of family relationships. We wish you and your loved ones health, happiness, and the courage to build bridges in your own lives.